University College Dublin's Centre for Institute for Environmental and Sustainability Research. Fundamentally, we're a multidisciplinary community that draws on a wide range of disciplines across the arts, humanities, engineering, architecture, sciences and social sciences. And we work together and with others on pressing environmental challenges nationally, internationally and locally. With the news cycle dominated by the pandemic and politics, it can be very hard for environmental research and researchers to get airtime. So that was really part of the momentum for this particular discussion, and I'm really interested to hear what everybody has to say this afternoon about that, about environmental research in the media. We're very grateful to Louise Holden for agreeing to chair the session. Louise is co-director of FH Media Consulting, which is a communications firm specializing in science and research. Before setting up FH Media with fellow journalist Gráinne Falla, Louise was education and research correspondent with the Irish Times for 15 years, so she's very much on home turf here. So the Earth Institute has really benefited from work with Louise and Gráinne over the last couple of years to deliver media training workshops to our researchers. And once again, thanks very much for taking on this role this afternoon, Louise, and I'll hand over to you at this point.
Great. Thanks very much, Tess. Yeah, so I suppose the first question I want to ask, it speaks to what Kayle just mentioned there about the pressure to get stories to cut through, and there's so much going on in the media, and not just so much to compete with, but also so much information and so much research output in the area of environmental science. So I'm going to start with you, John Gibbons, and I wonder, how do you prioritise your coverage in that context?
The unmute button. Yeah, I'll say in a way, Louise, I'm the odd fish here because I work, I guess, at my own pace as a freelancer. So I'm not tied to a particular news desk. So I work on feature stories and opinion pieces for different outlets, plus some of my own work as well. So really, that's I'm not sort of, as I say, tied to a particular news agenda. But obviously, what I'm most interested in following would be I suppose, where I take my lead from primarily is from climate research as that breaks, and also I would say watching biodiversity. So climate and biodiversity research, keeping an eye on them, seeing what's coming out in the papers, seeing how that's being covered in some of the scientific press like Scientific American and so on, keeping an eye on that, and then looking at where some of that might have applicability here in Ireland. Some does, some doesn't, but I guess getting it across the editor's desk, that's a whole other challenge.
Yeah, so on that, I'll move to you, Sylvia, now in the Irish Times. Do you find that you're having to lobby for certain stories, or how do you get what you want covered on a daily basis in the paper?
Well, I work on contract as a features writer, so I work across kind of health, environment and science. So sometimes I'm asked to do things, and then other times I'm pitching things. So I'm pitching to different editors. I'm pitching to the health and family editor, the science editor, sometimes the education editor. And really I'm kind of driven by my own instinct on what I think will make a good story, and you know, what is of interest to the public right across those areas. So yeah, usually it works. Sometimes I have to wait a little bit for the piece to appear, but my ideas are mainly accepted, and yeah, I'm inspired by a whole range of things, which I guess we'll get to later. But I am very aware of how COVID has dominated the last 9 months and pushed out a lot of other stories.
And on that, I'm going to ask Kayle and O'Doherty this on prioritising coverage. There isn't always a lot of room for environmental science coverage in mainstream media, for want of a better word. How do you prioritise, and what stories do you tend to push?
Well, I don't so much lobby. I think I plead. You know, yeah, this year has been miserable. You know, climate and environmental and biodiversity issues were beginning to gain momentum. I only joined the Irish Independent with this beat late last year, and we had great plans. And, you know, and this year had a natural momentum about it because we should be in COP at the minute, and there would be all the pre-meetings and discussions going into that and so on. And obviously that all went out the window. So yeah, I do have to fight for space, and there isn't, you know, a mindset against giving space to these issues, but it's just our schedules change by the day. Our news list changes by not quite by the hour, but you know, every few hours. You know, everything can turn on sixpence depending on what is said in the Dáil, or depending on what Tony Holden says at 6 o'clock. So yeah, I'm getting used to sort of, you know, stories just falling down the news list and then disappearing. You know, having said that, we're still getting it in there as much as we can. And because, you know, I think the awareness is there that no matter what's going on, the climate is still there. The biodiversity issue, I think that even that term has come into the public mind, so we can't neglect it. We maybe can't give it as much space as we would be if COVID hadn't hit, but it's in there. It's in there on an ongoing basis. We haven't sort of.
And are you finding, Caroline, that you're having to piggyback environmental stories onto COVID stories or onto geopolitical stories?
I suppose we did a little bit. I'm not quite sure the ordinary public have made the links as much as scientists have, taking the overview between how COVID landed upon us and how that's linked to what we've done to the natural world. I'm not sure people are even in a headspace to see it that way too much. I mean, yeah, I have delivered stories like that, but I suppose I'm almost treating them slightly separately. And a little bit because I think there can be a bit of exhaustion with COVID, even though people seem to lap up everything that's written about it. But I do want to treat it as a separate issue, and when it's relevant, to make the links. But you can only jam so much into a story on climate or biodiversity. So, you know, and I still find that it's baby steps at times, because the terminology is still, it hasn't been in the use in mainstream media, you know, for all that long. So the stories, we need to keep them, we don't need to overclutter them. So it's not hiding the links with the other issues that are going on, but it's not ramming too much into a story at the same time.
Kayle Crosson, I'd like to go to you now. I know that you write for Green News.ie, so you would be specifically writing to an audience that is probably versed in the terminology. Having said that, there's still an awful lot of research coming out every day, and a lot of good news and bad news. How do you choose what to cover? Is there so much you can do in a day?
I was on mute there. There is definitely only so much you can do in a day. I think for me, because I'm the editor of my own publication right now, I can kind of prioritize what I want to cover. What I am trying to focus on is bringing in kind of an intersectional lens as much as I can into this issue, particularly with the Build Back Better. We've seen so much recovery plans come out, and I cover both Irish and European developments. So I've been trying to really highlight the fact that we are trying to build back better from this, and where does the climate fit into that? So it's an interesting thing to look at.
I suppose that takes me to a question that I wanted to ask later in the session, but since you've touched on it, I may as well ask it now. And while I'm talking to you, Kayle, I'll ask you, do you consider yourself to be a campaigning journalist in this space? Do you have a mission with your journalism?
So I would say what my mission would be twofold: to definitely bring power to account. That's always been the role of journalism. And also, we want to inform the electorate. So if we, in journalism, we're holding people to the pledges that they said they were committing to and measuring based on data where that's going, that's definitely a crucial role for us. And I would say another thing, and Emily Atkin put this much more articulately than I did in her newsletter Heated, but we're informing the electorate of how policy decisions are affecting how we're living. So one bugbear of mine that I've written about quite a bit is when we see storm coverage nationally across the board, we don't see it linked to the climate crisis, when we know that for every 1 degree of warming, there's 7% more water vapor in the air. So making those connections for me in my reporting is incredibly important, because it also informs people what they should expect from policymakers and how they should behave in the voting booth.
Okay. I'm going to put that question to you, John, as well, because I know that you tend to write in this area and you have your own blog and so forth. Do you have a kind of a mission with your work overall that you're trying to pursue?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't. I think it's okay. It's something I would wear with a certain amount of pride, to be a campaigning journalist in this area, because I think objectivity has been almost a problem for journalism here. the model of balance has actually, I won't say crippled, but I think it's held back journalistic coverage of environmental issues, because for years, and I'm at this about 15 years in the environmental space, and for the first half of that, I was engaged in these pointless semantic debates on the radio, even on the TV, with people who were basically putting an argument that had no basis in fact. And they were being entertained because, as in, they were being media platformed because there was the idea that there was some kind of big balanced debate going on. So from that point of view, I was happy to take a position on it, not to say I view everybody's opinions equally. Really, the opinions I view are the opinions that are coming from science and the opinions that are based in fact. And I guess for people maybe in more recent years who are getting their heads around the whole fake news phenomenon, I can tell you, anyone who's been involved in environmental journalism, we saw that coming years ago. And all the moves, all the playbook that has hit kind of gone mainstream in the last 4 years, we experienced this over the last decade and a half of the disinformation machinery, well backed, well financed, very well connected, pushing out a false narrative, and also basically crippling the media's, not all of the media's, of course, the media is a church with many rooms, but crippling the response. And even seeing, really mainstream programs like Primetime absolutely bogged down in this, unable to actually approach it from the point of view of anything other than a cockfight. He said, she said, and let the audience decide. That model of journalism hasn't served us well. So yeah, in that regard, I'm happy to nail my colors. I think on my Twitter account, I describe myself as speaking out and freaking out, and I think we all suffer a little bit of that. So yeah.
I'd like to discuss this in particular with Sylvia and Caroline. I'll start with you, Sylvia, because what John referred to, that idea of having to strike a sort of a balance, which in some ways, in many ways, is a false balance. There can be considerations that come into play when you're writing for a particular publication around this. You have a particular readership to serve, you have advertisers. Do you find that you are ring-fenced a little bit, or you have to make decisions based on those considerations, the very specific readership and advertisers of your publication? I'll ask you first, Sylvia.
No, I don't actually. I think, again, there's a big distinction between being a features writer and being a news reporter. The news reporter's role is much more to keep up to date on what the government is or isn't doing, and the policy space and the legislation space. And I feel I am not so much a campaigning journalist, but a more kind of consciousness raising or awareness raising journalist. And I'm really driven as much by positive initiatives in the whole kind of sustainability space, as much as watching out for the problems of biodiversity loss and the poor uptake of renewables, which incidentally is improving. But so I would have written like early on, the Irish Times had an environment features page for a few years at quite a crucial time, I think, when people didn't really understand a lot of these issues. So like I would have been really excited about the circular economy, for instance, and the reuse of raw materials, about zero waste communities. Like an American woman came to Trinity maybe 5 years ago talking about the zero waste movement. And so I'm very kind of inspired by the newness of things in the sustainability space, and like food sharing initiatives, which is driven by Trinity College, for instance, geography department, community renewable energy initiatives, even now new moves to use our bogs to grow medicinal herbs and to develop birch water. That's all kind of science linked, a lot of these projects. So I'm actually quite excited by these. That's not to say that I'm not aware of the problems, and also like say the need for broader land use mapping, and I would have written about that, and farmers working with nature, continuous cover forestry, the importance of healthy soil. In fact, when I wrote a piece about soil, my editor first said, "What? you're going to write about soil on the features page. And I said, yeah, it's very important to have healthy soil. And then suddenly, and that was actually an environmental NGO that drove that campaign across Europe for healthy soil. So I really see what drives me is broadening this debate and introducing these subjects to a wide audience of people who are happy to read a long feature article and kind of get to grips with the subject and remember next time what the circular economy is, what food waste is, you know, why Ireland has, I wrote about why Ireland lagged behind on the retrofitting for houses and what other countries were doing, and problems with fast fashion, a big feature on fast fashion, and then also linking in with the health impacts of the climate crisis and air pollution. And so I think as a journalist and even as a person, I'm kind of driven by broadening out and talking about things rather than just always sort of what the government is or isn't doing. Not to devalue that, that's hugely important, but that's just the space I work in.
Mm-hmm. So it's more, and we will return to this, it's probably more on the consumer empowerment side. Consumer is an awful word, but you know what I mean, to give people an opportunity to properly engage with it rather than just be passive consumers of this news.
Although I am very conscious that that whole old idea that it's our responsibility as individuals to solve the environmental problems, that is completely inaccurate. I'm so aware that it is the government, it is legislation, it is the business community, it is what industry is and isn't doing. But I think there is always a zeitgeist kind of thing going on. And if you can if these articles contribute to that, then the CEOs of companies are reading the Irish Times as well. You know, it's not just kind of what you're buying down in the shop or not buying, or whether you're recycling properly or not. Everybody is reading. So in that sense, I suppose the Irish Times does have the audience right across the business, the policymakers, as well as the rest of us, you know, who are just living our lives without much power, I should say.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to put that question to you now, Caroline, because I know from having worked alongside independent journalists over the years in press rooms and listening to the kind of pressures that you guys sometimes come under to serve certain aspects of your readership. And obviously the Irish Independent traditionally would have a lot of agricultural sector readership and so forth. Does that weigh into the decisions that are made by you and further up the chain by your editors and so forth?
It doesn't, to a degree. Now, if you read the Farming Independent, which is a really popular supplement on a Tuesday, you might say differently. And certainly there are voices within that part of the paper who do express views. We're not going to tolerate climate deniers or anything like that. We've moved on from that. But there will be, particularly those who feel that they're being asked to do more and to sacrifice more for the move towards zero carbon than others. And that's perspective. Sometimes I think it's overstated, but it does allow for at least a discussion around it. So we'll allow people have their say, because sometimes, even if we do feel excuse me, that they're overstating it, they are actually raising issues that do need to be addressed by government and by policy. Because if people are complaining, a certain amount of complaining is for the sake of complaining, and most complaining is done for a reason. So let's look at the reasons rather than dismiss the complainers, if you like. So that's that end. In my end of the paper, I suppose my mission is it is to take the issues away from the fringe and bring them into mainstream. And that's, the unpalatable stuff, the tricky stuff, the science stuff, the science terminology, try and get it in there. And then the trickier things about, pollution and sewage that everybody turns their nose up and doesn't really want to hear, as well as the exciting things, there are breakthroughs, and just try and bring that in more into mainstream, so that people almost expect it. I would say if suddenly all education stories disappeared off the paper, people will be wondering, why aren't you covering education anymore? Or if health issues disappeared, or if consumer affairs issues disappeared, or if politics disappeared. People expect to see it. I'd like to get to a stage pretty soon where people expect to see environmental, climate, biodiversity stories and wonder why they aren't there if they're not.
So do you feel that, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, you give the impression that you're kind of leading your readership along a little bit? I don't mean to sound patronizing towards your readership, but in terms of you're having to develop the language and everything for people and bring people along with you.
Yeah, I think now there'll be a certain number of readers who absolutely know everything inside out and know more than I do, and there's the specialist readers. But I think for that sort of general bulk of people, there's still a lot of confusion, and I I know it from my friends and my wider circle. I know that the questions that people ask, I've made assumptions about what people know because I'm reading this day in and day out, and that takes you back sometimes when you realize actually people don't know. They do know the broad, they know what's going on, they know the broad sweep. They're kind of confused about where they fit into this picture. And so one of the worst examples and best examples of that is people have no idea what food waste has got to do with carbon emissions and climate change.
Right.
You know, they just don't make that connection. So things like that, you know, you're trying to constantly just explain, to keep it simple, get it into the mainstream stories, so that, as I say, they expect to see it there, and when they do see it, they understand it. It's not a story that's alien to them. It's a story for them.
Okay. And that's interesting intel for the likes of our researchers who are listening today, and people like myself, that you can't be making assumptions about people's prior knowledge of these areas, that we do have to bring people along. Want to ask you all now, and I'll stick on the same round so I don't miss anybody out. I'll go back to you, John, on the subject of where you source your stories. I know you're very active on Twitter. I wonder, do you find stories and people there, or where do you go on a daily basis to get the really good stuff?
Yeah, Twitter is a good start. I would follow and be followed by quite a few people, I suppose, in the research field, which means it's an early warning system. I would also get emails and DMs from people working as researchers in universities and so on, who just say, look, you should be aware of X, Y, Z. I'm sure exactly the same as the other folks talking about here. So they would be probably the main channels. Also, as I say, there are specialist, particularly climate websites like Climate Central and so on, that one would check back with on a fairly regular basis and look at the research stories that they're picking up and see kind of, again, some of them have applicability in Ireland, others don't. So I would keep an eye on those. So that would be a kind of a jump off point. And obviously I have my own particular hobby, horses, don't we all? I guess the agricultural beat is one that I find particularly interesting in Ireland. I think, kind of marking the agricultural lobby on emissions, because it's our single largest sector. So I have different channels of kind of keeping an eye on them. For example, I've got a very nice tillage farmer who keeps sending me DMs on WhatsApp about what's going on in that particular area, and it's great because you're getting it literally from the worm's eye view of what's happening at, literally at a farm side level. So that they would be the kind of informal channels that I'm sure everybody on the call here, we all use them. And but yeah, I think getting information and getting pointers is not the problem. I think it's actually sorting, processing, and then wrapping them up. Well, I find anyway, I spend a lot of my time wrapping them up, disguising them as something else before I try and slide them across the editorial desk, Say, yeah, I've got a really good angle on COVID here. Honestly, I swear I'm not just going to sneak in a story about climate. I swear I'm not, I think, I know, so one has to be a little ingenious or a little creative, let's say, on that sometime, but that would be my general approach.
Right. Kayle, I'm going to put that question to you. Where do you generally go for stories? Do you use sources? Do you go back to the same people all the time, or do you cruise around the internet, or how do you do it?
I will, like, if I'm looking for a news source, like if I've been relying on one person for a repeated amount of quotes, I might ask them, like, do you know someone else also working in this field? Just for diversity of voices is really important. I think in terms of how I would source longer stories that I work on, I've been trying to follow kind of explainer models of storytelling. I think it's really important, particularly one that did quite well with us was the Supreme Court ruling. We did an explainer the week after that came out, and I was talking to Dr. Anya Ryle about it, and she was able to take me through exactly what the ruling was. I think there was some public confusion of what it meant going forward, because it was in regards to a 2015 Act and a 2017 plan. And then the 2019 Climate Action Plan had come out. So I think sometimes, even though that wasn't involved in the judgment itself, the final judgment. So looking at kind of even just like anecdotally talking to friends, if they hear news about the environment or climate and they're saying, I don't really understand what this means, in a way that's like a source for ideas. Because like what Caroline said, I definitely make the assumption quite a lot that people are at the same level that we're at with understanding the stories that we're getting into our inboxes. So definitely trying to break down things and make them digestible and look at what it means going forward is important for how I source my ideas.
And would you follow academics or researchers on Twitter or on Facebook or other platforms? Do you pick up stories that way too?
Yeah, definitely. Carbon Brief is also a great source with a lot of climate scientists on it, so I can highly recommend that too. And I think they share quite a lot of research as it comes out. And if you subscribe to their newsletter, every day they send out an update, and there's always a section on academia and research that has recently been published.
So I'm going to put that question to you, Sylvia. You have a very, very broad church in terms of your coverage of environmental issues, as you've mentioned, and you tend to draw things together. Do you go to the same people? Do you have people you go back to check in with, or how do you source your stories?
I suppose I have a wide range of contacts, but also I would get a lot of press releases from universities on various research, which is I'm quite interested in, depending on the context of that. I'd get all the Environmental Protection Agency reports. I'd get releases from environmental NGOs, from the Economic and Social Research Institute, other government agencies. I go to environment conferences and seminars and follow them on Zoom now sometimes. I might get some books in. I also think Twitter is good, actually, if you follow the right people. You hear about things internationally. And yeah, in fact, one of the pieces I wrote about Danny Dorling's book, which was kind of linked to UCD, I followed I watched the seminar, and then just kind of thought, yeah, this is worth talking about, actually. He was talking about the great slowdown, if anyone's interested, which is already happening, actually, that the population won't get to the what was it, 50 billion that they thought it was going to get to, that it'll never reach that amount. So it's always very important to think about what we accept as almost beliefs that things are going to happen, and question them. So I think that's also important in the whole sustainability agenda moving on, sort of not always to accept everything that seems to be the standard belief. So yeah, so a wide range, really.
Okay. And would you get invited by research institutes and so forth to attend seminars they might be holding, or do you tend to kind of have to seek those out yourself?
I usually hear about them. Sometimes I'm invited, but no, I'd kind of hear about them as opposed to be sort of widely invited to them, I think.
Okay. And I want to put that question then to you, Caroline. How you're on a news beat? It's pretty frenetic some days, I would imagine. How do you get to your sources quickly?
Well, you know, what Sylvia said there is that there is a lot of outreach by a lot of organisations, professional bodies, NGOs, state agencies are one. I do shadow a lot of the state stuff quite closely, the Climate Action Committee, the Department of the Environment, Department of Housing, Heritage, Agriculture, all the committees associated with that, all the PQs that the various TDs will be putting in. Then you've got, Irish Water, you've got the Water Advisory Body, the Water Forum, there are quite a huge number of agencies, and you're trying to check in with them, if not daily, certainly a lot, because they are in control, and they have a lot of funding, and they're the ones making regulations or supposedly implementing regulations. We do need to keep an eye on those, and that could be quite dry, and you might not find something today or tomorrow, but you might see a trend developing, and it might turn into a story at a later stage. Twitter is good, and I'm sort of, not following everybody. I'm sort of gradually building that up, because there's certain people you feel you can trust. I do like to check in on the universities now and again. I find some are better than others, and it's even as I say, you might just need something for background, or to, you know, I suppose support what you believe is maybe something that's beginning to happen, or moving. It would be useful, you know, if universities maybe I kept listings of the kind of research projects that are underway. You might be able to tap into that in some way, and it can support something you're doing, or it might lead to an idea for something. Because, you know, trust is a big issue. You know, every time I get an email from an institute or an organization, you know, I want to know, is it an industry body? Is it a, you know, is it something just pulled together for a particular event or conference? Or, you know, is this a very solid, reliable, trustworthy institution? So that I tend to look to the universities that we have, and you know, I would rather go there than elsewhere. So, you know, there are things that might be improved in terms of, it's not a priority. Scientists, their work is in the science lab. It's not on the phone marketing themselves. But, you know, there may be little improvements that could be made there.
It's interesting that you say that in the context of our listeners, our audience here, because this is the Earth Institute. If you were to get an approach from, I mean, there's a lot of new research centres and institutes springing up. Some of them are SFI funded, some of them are funding coming from other sources. When somebody contacts you from one of these agencies, do you have to, the first thing you have to do presumably then is due diligence and make sure they're not just a lobby group for some company?
Absolutely, yeah, we do that, you know. And what's got tricky, and I do understand why it happens, there's a lot of big businesses who help to fund research, and so you have research institutes, you know, within universities, and you're constantly kind of checking, is that a standalone thing, or is that, who are the, so I tend to look to the personnel involved. You know, institutes get names attached to them that may or may not reflect a private, you know, industry investment, and sometimes that's just perfectly legitimate most of the time, but you do need to check into it just so you know where this research is coming from, where the angle is, and generally you can sort that out by just checking the personnel, because you can see their credentials. Once you can see their credentials, you feel safe, you feel you're on trusted ground.
Which brings me to my final question, which I suppose will have the most pointed reference for the people listening, if anybody out there is looking to tap into media a bit more to get your story, your research story out there, to influence policy. And I'm going to ask you this, Kayle, do you work much with Irish researchers? Do you find that they ever approach you directly? And would you have an example of a research story which managed to make it from the lab or the field through you and into the public?
I tend to get most research stories via press release. That would be the majority of it. I don't very frequently have people openly emailing me with like a specific bit of research, but I am very open to that. So I am open to those emails if they come in. I think a good example definitely is research that's linking the climate crisis to other areas of our lives. I think one thing that happened in the media narrative for a very long time was we were looking at the climate crisis in just terms of CO2 emissions and what that meant. And it was very siloed into one channel. I think two pieces of research that come to mind that were really effective and in terms of their reach as well was the RCSI study that came out a couple of months ago linking air pollution to stroke hospital admission done by RCSI. That was really interesting in linking the climate crisis to health. Another piece of research that just came out this week, I saw The Guardian covered it, was about the amount of airline emissions that are generated by the wealthiest in the world. Again, linking the climate crisis to the inequality crisis. So in terms of the type of research that I'm really interested in, because we're kind of moving into this new narrative of how the climate crisis intersects with all these ongoing crises as well, that kind of research I find really interesting.
John, to that question again, in terms of directly connecting with researchers and bringing their work forward, have you had much experience of that?
Some, for sure. Yeah, I would have had some dealing with researchers, say, for example, in NUI Maynooth. But as we're talking about it, a phrase springs to mind, and that phrase is policy-based evidence making. And we get quite a bit of that in Ireland, where essentially, you know, the policy has been set at a certain level, and you know the hapless researchers are basically sent out to find the evidence to support this. And if I can share a little example, I promise to be nice. When I was doing some deep background, I came across a 2008 paper published by a Teagasc researcher. And it's a terrific paper. and he was talking about the emissions trajectory of Irish agriculture, and explained how it sort of peaked around 1990, but now it was in alignment and it was coming down on a steady glide path. And he was explained, you know, all the policy steps that had occurred to make that happen, and how where it would be by 2020. I hope I'm not giving away a good story here. I shouldn't be saying this without journalists around. Okay, forget everything I just said. Anyway, the point, I suppose, is then, if you like, policy changed. And then from 2011 onwards, it was grow, grow, grow. So suddenly emissions management became just something for PR, and the focus was to justify and explain a growth trajectory. So what we now have are, and these are great, terrific researchers, but essentially they're answering different questions because the organization has now got to justify an expansionary program. And, you know, their upper management at the authority level is, say, for example, is now dominated by dairy farmers. So I imagine that in turn sets the tone for how a researcher in an organization like that has got to say, well, okay, what way is the wind blowing at the moment? I'm not suggesting any one researcher would, you know, but it's a question of where does this organization, where's this organization going, right? And I think these changes are very subtle. And that's why you have to leap back, like I did there, 12 years to actually realize that this organization has completely changed direction. But it did it in a series of small incremental steps over a number of years. So nobody really noticed, right? But in fact, it is now faced practically in the opposite direction to where it was faced at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. So they're the kind of sort of subtle little shifts that we like to keep an eye on, because as that phrase I use, policy-based evidence making, researchers, you know, if you're being recruited as a researcher into a particular organization, okay, you might be lucky enough to be doing primary research, but in a lot of cases, you're going to be doing research that is to support whatever the dominant narrative of that organization is. What do we want to do? And then the researchers will fall in line naturally and organically with delivering that. So that's why I'm always try and keep a kind of a slightly skeptical eye on some of the research that you see coming through, because what I want to know is why. Why are we researching this, but we're not researching that? And that's a slightly different question.
Of course it is, yeah. Can you speak to that, Sylvia? Do you find yourself having to second guess research that's coming across your table sometimes, wondering, you know, what's behind this, what's the motivation, and where's it headed, who's it serving?
I think that's very interesting what you're raising, John. I'd like to see you write about that, actually.
Me too.
Yeah, I really would. I think these state bodies have a different role, one would hope, to the universities. And I suppose a couple of pieces I wrote early this year before the pandemic hit seemed to feed right into the importance of trusting scientists. There was one actually, Maria, how do I pronounce her name? Bagdavan, I think it might be something like that. She works in the philosophy department in UCD. Apologies, Maria, for mispronouncing your name. And she was involved in a piece of research about the distrust in experts that I wrote about actually last October. And then just later, early this year, the Royal Irish Academy actually were involved in both of these events, and they did invite me to them, about the importance of clear science communication. But I think it's actually, if I may quote here, Professor Luke Drury said, it's important for scientists to explain how science is done, that it's not the absolute truth, but rather the best possible information from the available evidence. But also they both spoke about the importance of scientists being trustworthy. So I think it's hugely important that we understand who's funding their research and what the underlying agenda is for the study. I mean, sometimes it's valid, sometimes it is. Like there was an interesting study from Trinity there about 2 weeks ago about microplastics in infant feeding bottles and how we we didn't realize the dangers were so close to us, if you like. And I kind of followed up on that with a piece that will be in soon, hopefully, on the science page about how we still actually don't know the impact of micro and nanoplastics within our bodies. We all know about the plastic pollution on our beaches and affecting, you know, fish and marine species, but the impact on our human body. So there's a kind of a whole area of science research which is just kind of developing. There's something else. Oh yes, the other thing I just wanted to quote from another Royal Irish Academy event was that the role of chief scientific advisors, which is a bit tricky here actually, it isn't very clear, but he said that it's very important that scientists communicate clearly what's known, what's partially known, what's unknown, and what's not knowable, and actually deal with potential controversies by engaging with people. So just in terms of researchers watching, I think it's very important that scientists communicate. And in the whole COVID space now, we've had a lot of medical researchers saying what we don't know. And that, for me, that's been very interesting over the 9 months, watching how they're just learning literally as they go along, but being prepared to say what they don't know is just important as saying what they know, I think.
And I just finish up then the question round, Caroline, thanks very much for that, Sylvia, on that question of trust in science. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about it, and there's a lot of people urging everybody to trust in science. And that is obviously in reaction to geopolitical events and events across the pond. But are you finding in Ireland that Irish people are do they still have trust in researchers and scientists through?
And I think they do.
Through the work you're writing, or are you feeling that sense of mistrust as well here? You do.
No, I think people do. But it is, you know, it must be clear what they're saying, and say if it's, you know, not all scientists are brilliant communicators, it's definitely improving. But if it isn't clear in what they're saying, it's my job to make it clear. And if in clearing it up there actually isn't a whole lot to be said, or things are at an early stage, you know, we absolutely have to draw back from overstating it, because that's where science and writers lose credibility. So I think that is very important. What Sylvia said there, that quote is a great quote. But, you know, it also pushes us to you know, use whatever science is there and listen to it, but to go further than that, you know, things like freedom of information and access to information on the environment, where you might get it freer, more open, more bolder statements made, that aren't intended necessarily to be public. So, you know, that's important. It's important to go to different sources and to try and get the clearest possible picture that you can, because, you know, scientists and researchers are employed by institutions, they are employed to do a job, and you know, science is fact, but facts have doubts within them, and, you know, things can be interpreted in different ways. So it's, you know, I would love to say everything is absolute in science, and I don't think it is, or at least it can be construed in slightly different ways. So it is tricky. I feel for researchers there, and you know, Sylvia also mentioned that microplastic study. I said if there was ever an example of what COVID has done to reporting this year, that was an amazing study. That had all the elements of a study that would have run for days, on Joe Duffy, you know, follow-ups, features. This was science in your own kitchen. In fact, in your own hand, baby in your hand, bottle in your hand, you know, they said, do not shake the bottle. That should be the information going to, you know, every pediatrician's office, every midwife, every public health nurse, every infant formula manufacturer. Tell parents not to shake the bottle. We're all probably fed on shaken bottles. I thought, there's an amazing study. It's right in your hand. It's so visible. It's so clear. It's so relevant. And yes, it did get published all around the world. It did, you know, some stories have legs. COVID cut the legs out from under that story. Didn't get follow-up. Now I'm going to be interested to see what Sylvia writes, but, you know, in a couple of months I'm going to check with the manufacturers and the public health guidance and say, did they change their any of their recommendations on this? Because two things we do: we boil water, you know, to kill the germs for the baby bottle, and then you shake it with the formula powder in it. And here were these scientists saying, got to tell people not to do that. And that story got one day's publicity and disappeared. And I would have put money on it running, and it just didn't. COVID has overtaken everything. And I would love to come out from under this blanket of COVID and get a whole fresh start on this next year, because there's so much that we need to be bringing to people, you know, beyond what's preoccupying them at the moment. And, you know, I'm looking forward to doing that, you know, next year, hopefully.
Brilliant. Thank you, Caroline and Sylvia and Kayle and John. I'm going to pass back to Tasman now. Is it Will or who's picking up from here?
I can ask some questions if you like. I've got a few in the Katrina here, a few in the chat box. 1 second. So somebody just asked, so Grace just asked, you've spoken about how you have to vet stories that come across your desk and do due diligence to check the source, the funding, the motivation. Do you find problems getting researchers to trust you in return, though, if you need to approach scientists for comments or evidence to support their stories?
Yes, I think they trust us if you explain what you're writing about clearly to them. I mean, it's up to us to be clear as well, actually. So I don't find researchers are mistrustful. No.
Okay. Anybody else have it?
Yeah, I give a slightly different, again, I'll answer that in my usual sideways way. I did a piece for DSmog UK. It's a British-based website that kind of looks at particularly climate and related issues last year. And the focus there was on, I suppose, Science Foundation Ireland and how it makes decisions and allocates its funding. And I think this arose from some comments by the Director General of Science Foundation Ireland that were, shall we say, were considered surprising. And I think for me, one of the interesting upshots of that was how over the last number of years, Science Foundation Ireland has kind of changed its orientation towards what they call results-based science. In other words, they're interested in funding science that makes money, as opposed to pure research. Now, of course, if we knew which science made money, I guess that'd be easy. Whereas I suppose traditionally, scientific research, a lot of pure research, many of the most exciting inventions in science, as we know, have come from pure research that answered questions that we didn't even know that we wanted to ask. And yet, SFI, which controls 170 million euro in science funding in Ireland, the message has gone out. And I've spoken to researchers about this, and they're very clear that the message from SFI is, unless you can show us how somebody's going to make money out of your research, we're not that interested in funding it. And I guess from my point of view as a journalist, that's really interesting, because I know there's quite a lot of researchers who are not happy at the fact that SFI has that very shall we say, hard-nosed research slash commerciability focus. Now, that may not be everybody's experience, but certainly the people that I've spoken to, including in preparing that story, gave me particular examples of how they felt pure research was winnowed out in the process, and you're left with what they call applied research. And researchers would regard applied research as second grade research, second tier research. What most researchers are interested in doing is primary research. And of course, the beauty of primary research is you don't know where it's going, and even if there'll ever be an actual outcome from it. So anyway, that's a
definitely, yeah, John. I think that would be something we hear a lot in the university is that people feel primary fundamental research should be more funded nationally. So we have a question which is slightly different direction from Miriam, which is just about generating more critical environmental writing. Could it be something that could there be a prize for critical environmental writing as part of something like the Young Scientists, or how can you kind of encourage younger writers to kind of think about the environment, sustainability as something they want to write about? Does anybody have a view on that? Caroline or Kayle, maybe?
I'll jump in maybe and let Kayle. Kayle's younger than me, so she can go next. But I mean, I think it would be a good idea. I think children in particular have been taught, you know, to think globally, act locally, act personally. So it's about, and you know, it's not a bad thing in a way, but it is about what rubbish they pick up, and, you know, recycling their cans and things like that. And I think it's time for and as they will get a more sophisticated understanding, hopefully, as they grow, but it's probably never too soon to introduce them to the more complex issues, and that might be a way of doing it. You know, maybe some sort of a critical reporting writing. Absolutely, it allows them to think about what they're doing, but put it into a broader context. I think it's quite a good idea, actually.
Great. Kayle, would you have a view on that, on kind of on things that encourage people to get into writing? Maybe
yeah, I think
university or.
Yeah, incorporating it into things like Young Scientist or university papers as well, I think are really important. Green News in the past has taken op-eds from school strikers, which I think is also really powerful, because, you know, I've been covering school strikes for almost 2 years now, and I would often go up to people and take quotes, and I would ask the question. I think there's something really powerful about having someone who's participating in the movement write their own account and have that kind of put out there as an op-ed is quite powerful as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's a great thing to do. I have a question from Sylvia Tracy, who's one of our members, and she was saying, as I think we touched on the issue of soil earlier, Sylvia, you mentioned it, but Sylvia works a lot on soil, and she was wondering, what advice would you give to researchers trying to make soil sexy and exciting, as there's a few people in UCD trying to do this. Sylvia, do you want to touch on that? You've already explored the world of soil, you already find it sexy and exciting.
I'm not sure about sexy and exciting, but I suppose to see soil as, I suppose it's one of the essentials, you know, along with water and clean air, and try and put it in the context really as one of the fundamental essentials of our environment. Really, it kind of got pushed out of that, in the sense that we're all very aware of air pollution, we're aware of water pollution, but it seems to be maybe farmers and foresters only were aware of soil, whereas I think we all need to be aware about soil for the quality of our food. But just, if I may go back one step to the previous question, Antashka actually run a Young Reporters on the Environment competition that schools are invited to enter, and that's part of an international Young Reporters on the Environment project. And also the Young Social Innovators program in Ireland offers schools, transition year students in schools, a chance to kind of delve into issues that can be environmentally related. But I do agree with Caroline that we need to move beyond that sense of the individual responsibility, which was mentioned earlier, and make sure young people are educated on the corporate responsibility and the political responsibility, and, you know, all of that side of it as well.
Great, thank you. Loads of questions coming in now, but just one thing that I suppose a lot of people would have seen in the news recently was the bog slide in Donegal. And Suzanne just asked the question, do the panel have any thoughts on the fact that it took RTE several days to report on this story? John, would you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think we saw it first, of course, on social media. People up there on the, I think it was on the concrete platform, the basis for the wind farms. And so I think we all saw the film of the actual half a forest flowing down the hill, which is really just mind-boggling. So I'm surprised it would have taken RT so long to have seen the news value in that. It's absolutely extraordinary. And of course, it opens up some really interesting questions, like what the hell are we doing locating wind turbines on raised bogs, you know, in environmentally sensitive areas. So I think that's probably been the most valuable thing that's come out of this, is hopefully a very critical appraisal, because I know the people in the particular community that were affected were saying that they had just heard from the developer of this particular site news of another site a few kilometers away that they have planning in a similarly sensitive area, which is, you know, and I feel conflicted here, of course, because, you know, I'm a big fan, if you'll pardon the pun, of wind energy. I think it's great, but we've got to get it in the right place, and we're destroying a lot of you know, public goodwill, including among the environmental community, by allowing or tolerating the location of what should be a good thing, a wind farm, in the most horrendous place. But to answer your question about RTE, I think it's what we said in our preamble. I think they've split the role. I think for RTE, for a number of years, they had no environmental correspondent at all, for about 5 or 6 years. And then it was replaced. The role was then split between what's called science and environment. And I think that role is currently at the moment focused more on coronavirus. So I think it was probably a case that it wasn't on anybody's particular beat. I think that's what happened.
Yeah, I get you. Okay. One final question, and then I'll hand back over to Tasman to end the panel. It's a question from Sharon O'Rourke, and she was just wondering about how engaged you are as journalists with new policy activities or policy in the making. For example, the EU carbon roundtable discussions that are currently underway. Is that something you kind of tune into, policy making at an EU level, and how that's going to impact Ireland? Kayle, would you answer that one?
So actually today is a good example, because I wrote something up about the offshore energy strategy that came out of the EU today. EU strategy and EU policy affects us absolutely, particularly offshore energy, considering that in the program for government, I believe they're looking to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by the end of 2030. So looking at kind of where the EU is putting its roadmap and its blueprint is really important for our issues. In terms of like the developments, I would be kind of just following the EU press corner in terms of sourcing, and then going from there once the actual strategy is out. I think it's really worth doing deep dives on strategies. I did one on the EU hydrogen strategy, because again, it was something that people were like, what does this actually mean? What can we do with this sort of energy? So kind of taking a deep dive in strategies is important, I think, both for an actual content of it and what it means for Ireland.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, now there's lots of questions coming in and we haven't had the time to cover them all. But I'll hand back over to Taz to wrap up.
So thanks, Katrina, and thanks everybody for a really fascinating discussion. I think some real insights there for everybody.
I just want to do
how journalism around environmental issues works, and about the interface between researchers and journalists. So I hope that there's the start of some relationships there with Earth Institute members and yourselves in kind of helping to get those stories out there and on a real evidence-based on the basis of mutual trust as well. So really appreciate it. So I just want to wrap up by thanking very much the panelists. So Sylvia Thompson, John Gibbons, Kayle Crosson and Caroline O'Doherty, thanks very much indeed. Thanks to Louise for chairing the panel discussion. It was much appreciated. And thanks very much to Katrina and Will for organising the event. I think it was really interesting and really well attended. And so thanks finally to everybody that turned up to listen in and get involved and ask questions. So thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.